Well, good morning and welcome to Envoy, where we are people following Jesus. To those not yet, so glad you guys are here with us on this fine Father's Day weekend. Happy Fathers to all of you that are fathers and those of you all that have fathers. Give it a round of applause to these men who are often so overlooked and underappreciated. Isn't that right, men? No, just joking. No, speaking of which, hopefully my dad's watching. Happy Father's Day to my dad. It makes such a difference whenever we're involved in the life of our kids. And so I'm so grateful for those of you men that see your faith journeys as a priority, and you showed up today to be able to be enriched and also to lead your families. We're so thankful for that. We're in a series over this summer, and it's a series through the book of Hebrews. And the tagline is better, but we're going to be going through this kind of a section at a time, mainly a chapter at a time, all throughout the summer. And this particular book is really an interesting one because it's written to a Jewish audience, which most of us are not. But what happens is as the book goes through and it explains different things about kind of the Hebrew context and Jewish philosophy and their understanding of things, they are addressing some things that actually help us to understand the rest of the Bible better. Because even though we didn't live in that particular time, as we read through the Old Testament and even some of the New Testament concepts, then what we'll be able to do is we'll be able to better understand how Jesus himself is ultimately better than everything. And that's kind of how we started off this series, by talking about Jesus one-ups everything from the Old Testament as it pertains to the law and philosophy and people and prophets and all that kind of stuff. Last week we looked specifically at how Jesus is better than, he's greater than angels. This week we're going to be taking a look at Jesus is better than Moses. And so if you got your Bibles, go ahead and open them up, turn them on to chapter 3. That's where we're going to be sticking around. Now, we all understand last week as we talked about angels, there's this great intrigue with angels, and we talked about angels are incredible. Angels are awesome. So when you say Jesus is better than angels, you're like, whoa, he's even better than these kind of spiritual go-between the worlds. Like, that's pretty amazing, right? But this week, when we say Jesus is better than Moses, I think we need to be able to have kind of a conversation of what's the big deal about Moses. And this is why I say this, because in our context, we look at the Bible and we have these conversations and we already see Jesus in the purview, right? And so we look at Jesus and we're like, of course he's better than Moses. But when you actually take a look at the Jewish audience that the Hebrew writer was actually writing to, you have to understand that this is a monumental statement that goes into the equation of their understanding. So in order for us to be able to understand exactly what he's trying to write, we need to have a better understanding of the Jewish context of what this would have actually meant to them. Now, for instance, if I was to ask you guys to shout out the greatest person in American history, you might shout out names like George Washington, or Abraham Lincoln, or Martin Luther King Jr., or Nikola Jokic, you know? How about the Denver Nuggets, right? How about them, huh? I don't think he would qualify for the greatest American history. But anyway, the reality is we would throw out some names, and these are all top-tier people. Now, if we were to have some conversation, we'd probably have some disagreements and discussions as to who would actually kind of surface as being the greatest of all time in American history, right? But if you were to go to the Jewish people and you were to ask them that same question, who is the greatest person in all of Jewish history, you know who they would say? They would say Moses. Now, we look at the scripture, and those of us that grew up in Sunday school or you've been reading through the Old Testament, like, there's some amazing people in the Old Testament, right? There's some great guys. You got Abraham, who was like the father of the nation, who started off at the very beginning. And then you got guys like King David, who established them, brought them to prominence as a king in the area. But all of them, even though they're top-tiered individuals, they would actually submit to this guy named Moses in the history of the Jewish people. They would have seen Moses as being the greatest person and the greatest prophet within their history. He was mentioned 767 times in the Bible. He plays a big role. He plays a very big role in Jewish history. And so what we need to do is we actually need to go back and take a look and see, why is that actually the case? First of all, let's take a look at the significance of him as a miracle worker. You see, some of these other great people in the Jewish faith, they played prominent roles, but Moses had kind of a standout role in that he was a miracle worker, and he performed some amazing feats not only for the people of Israel, but for like all the other nations around to kind of take note that like the God of the Jewish people, he's a big God because he can do these supernatural things. Now, many of you guys are familiar with the story of Moses, but let me just walk you all through that a little bit in case you are not familiar with this. Moses grew up in Egypt while his Hebrew people were enslaved. His whole story is kind of this miraculous upbringing. They were killing a bunch of the Egyptians. Moses gets put in a basket and shipped down the river and ends up in Pharaoh's palace. And so he gets to grow up in the lap of luxury while his people are actually being enslaved at this time. And ultimately, the first 40 years of his life, he kind of spends in Pharaoh's palace until one day he recognizes the injustice happening to his Hebrew people, and he takes action and he ends up killing an Egyptian, and he has to flee into exile. He spends the next 40 years of his life as a shepherd in some barren lands learning humility. And so we get to this point in Moses' life where he's 80 years old, and up until this point, he really has nothing to show for his life. He's not done anything significant for the kingdom of God. But then all of a sudden, God comes to him and he goes, now you're ready. At 80 years old, now you're ready. And he sends a burning bush to Moses. And at that point in time, he calls him to go do this miraculous thing and set his people free from the land of Egypt. Now, before we get there, though, I just need to speak this in because I think there's somebody here that needs to hear this today. Some of us sometimes think, you know what, I've not done anything significant in my life up until this point, and so maybe God doesn't have anything significant for me. And to that, I would say, you're wrong. Maybe everything that you've been like going through and you've been preparing for up until this point is to put you in a place where God can actually finally use you as he wants you. Some of us and some of our older people in our congregation sometimes, and I hear this all the time, it's like, I just don't feel like I'm useful anymore. I don't feel like God's got anything for me anymore. I feel like my best days were before me. Guys, Moses was 80 years old before he even started the ministry that God had set out for him. That's an amazing thing. I got a chance to go with my daughters to visit one of our congregation members who's in an assisted living house, and I was having a conversation with her, and I've heard this before from her, but she's oftentimes felt like I was so involved in the church, and now I can't be involved anymore, and I just don't know if God's got anything for me. And so my little girls actually got a chance to pray for her, and we've been praying after that point as well, that God would just be able to show her that she still has value, she still has worth, she still has purpose, like God can still use her in the midst. And I actually got a call from her this past weekend, and she recounted this story of a cleaning lady who was in her room doing her thing and overheard part of the conversation she was had. And ultimately, this gal who felt like she didn't have any other purpose in this had an opportunity to step into this lady's situation and found out that she was pregnant and she was contemplating abortion. And so she got to speak into her life. The gal is waiting to be able to talk to somebody about this. And so she had an opportunity to be able to step in and offer guidance and wisdom and hopefully be able to save the life of a child in this place. Guys, if you got breath in your lungs, God's not done with you yet, all right? He's got some purpose for you, and it may be different than what you used to do, you know, but he's not done with you. And that was the case for Moses. He gets commissioned. This elderly man gets commissioned to go back to lead his people out of Egypt. You can imagine Moses is probably thinking, why didn't you use me when I was in my prime, right? And God's probably looking at him going, because I couldn't. You were a bonehead, right? But now I can finally use you because you've learned some of the lessons that I needed you to be able to learn. And so he says, I want you to go back and I want you to deliver my people from Pharaoh's hand. You all have to understand that Egypt was the powerhouse nation at this time. These Hebrew people had been enslaved for hundreds of years. This was going to be a very difficult, God-sized task that was going to require miraculous intervention in order for it to happen. Up until this point, again, guys, 80 years in the making, Moses has never performed a miracle up until this point. This was not in his repertoire. He wasn't out in the desert working on miracles. But all of a sudden, God comes in and says, you know what, I've got this plan for you, I got this purpose for you, and I'm going to empower you to do what it is that I've called you to do. And he starts to impart these miracles, partially, I believe, because miracles oftentimes give an indication that God is with somebody. When somebody performs a miracle, they can't do it in and of themselves. It shows that God is with them. And so when Moses went to the people initially, they needed to know, is this God? Because what we're about to do is kind of a big size task. And so Moses performs all of these miracles, starting with turning a staff into a snake. And then he calls on all these plagues that happened in the land of Egypt, to which Pharaoh says, hey, you guys are causing more problem than you are help. Please get out of here. And then they get to the Red Sea, and the Pharaoh's army is tracking them down, and there's no way to cross, and he stands up there and he parts the Red Sea. This is a story that was told for generations, this miracle-working man. He gets out to the desert and calls manna down from heaven, and he hits a rock and water comes out of it. Moses was a miracle worker of first class. He performed great feats. And one of the greatest feats that he actually performed was getting this obstinate people that God had chosen to the promised land that he had promised to them. So Moses was a miracle worker. But that was not the only reason why he was revered. He was revered not only because he could perform these miraculous signs, but he was also revered because he was a mouthpiece of God. He operated as a prophet, speaking on behalf of God to the people. See, people were, accustomed to living in Egypt and having to obey Pharaoh's rules, and they tried to maintain their faith, but it had been a long time since they heard from God, and so they needed somebody, and it happened to be Moses, to point them to this God that they knew and that they served. And so ultimately, Moses was credited for penning the first 5 books of the Bible known as the Pentateuch. Can you guys help me recount the first 5 books of the Bible? We got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Those are the first 5 books. Moses took time through the Holy Spirit's work to be able to pen these things so that we have the history there that we know of today. It's a big piece of the Old Testament if you've not actually got a chance to read through this. All right, let me take it to Numbers chapter 12. I want you to see what Moses has to say here. He says this, "Now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth." Who's writing this? Bonehead still. All right. Moses is writing this about himself, right? But then he switches gears in this particular passage, and this now is what God is saying. God said, and just to set this up, what happened here is that his sister and his brother are kind of getting a little jealous, and they're acting out, they're not obeying, they're not being respectful towards Moses. And so God actually gets involved in this family quarrel, and he's putting them in their place. And so God said, "Listen to my words. When there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, reveal myself to them in visions, and I speak to them in dreams." That's how God typically operates with prophets. He says, "But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all of my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" And he ends up giving his sister leprosy and putting him out of the camp. She learns her lesson and everything works out, okay? That's the story. But what you need to understand here is that God is showing that Moses is not just a prophet like prophets before, or prophets who come even after him. Even the Lord acknowledges that Moses stands like in a status of his own as a prophet, that God actually chooses to speak to him differently than he does the other prophets. He speaks to him, what he says, face to face. He knows my form. We'll be talking about that more in a minute. I was actually watching a documentary the other day recommended by somebody from our congregation, and it's called Father of Lights. And in this thing, it's really kind of encouraging the work that's happening, within the nations. But there's this Indian man who has this relationship with God where he goes around from village to village, and he shares his faith and he shares the gospel. But he has this really unique relationship with God in that every morning at 4 a.m., God wakes him up and speaks audibly to this guy. He speaks audibly, and ultimately what happens is God every day wakes him up and he gives him a plan, sometimes a step-by-step map of which village he wants to go to and who he wants to speak to and what he wants to accomplish there. It's an amazing thing. It's this story, and they go and they show some of the documentaries of meeting witch doctors and other people, tribal members and other religions and stuff like that. It's so cool. I don't know about you all, but God doesn't speak to me like that. He doesn't speak to me like that, but he does this unique way of being able to communicate to his people. Now, I do hear from God, but in different ways. You see, Moses stood out in his time because he heard from God, but he was more privileged than even this Indian man who got to hear from God at 4 o'clock in the morning. You see, as God has delivered these people from the hand of Pharaoh and he's brought them across the Red Sea, he understands that these people need to know him because he's been absent, or he's been looking at this from afar for a while, and so he needs somebody to come up and to be able to reveal himself to and through. And so he chooses Moses. Of all the people and all the prophets and all the time, he chooses to actually reveal himself to God. So he calls him up on a mountain, and there on the mountain, he actually gives Moses the 10 Commandments, right? He writes them down on a tablet. He lets them know. And what you all need to understand, this is different than what our understanding of this might be. Again, post-Jesus and looking at the Old Testament, oftentimes we see the 10 Commandments as being this list of rules and regulations. But you all need to understand it's so much more than that. You see, the 10 Commandments, especially as they were given initially, it was a revelation from God to be able to help other people and the Israelites understand who he was, to understand his character, to understand his desire and his design for things. This was the way by which they knew God and they knew what his desire was for them. And so God chooses to reveal himself through the law that he offers. Ultimately becomes known as the law of Moses because Moses is the one who gets to get it and gets to distribute it and gets to speak it to the people. But that wasn't the only thing that he chose to reveal up on that mountain. Some of you all might recall this story, but as Moses is standing there and he's just in awe of God and all that kind of stuff, he asks to be able to see God. And God says, you can't see me. Nobody can see me face to face and live. But you're special, Moses. And so what he does is he says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put you in this crag and this rock, and I'm going to put my hand over you so that I don't kill you as I pass by. And he puts his hand over him, and he passes by, and he allows Moses to see his backside. And so Moses gets to see his backside. And evidently, God's backside is just as glorious as his front side, all right? Because Moses comes down and it's as if he's seen him face to face. The Lord even communicates this. It's as if he's seen him face to face. This is as close as anybody could get or has gotten in the Old Testament to God and not died. Moses was chosen to be able to do this. And it was so cool because then he comes down the mountain with an amazing message, tablets in hand, and an amazing encounter. And being in the presence of God for that amount of time caused his face literally to radiate. You all remember hearing this in the story of Moses? He comes down the mountain and his face is actually glowing. So much so that it's like a huge distraction for some and other people are scared for their lives. They actually have to put a veil over his face until it fades away because they can't look at Moses and even him just being in the glory of God. You see, Moses was a mouthpiece of God through those latter 40 years. He spoke both to kings and pharaohs, right? And he guided and directed his people according to what God wanted for them. He was a miracle worker and he was a mouthpiece, but he was also a mediator. Not only did Moses speak on God's behalf to the people, he also spoke on the people's behalf to God. And this is actually really, really significant because, again, up until this point, there's really no way to be able to communicate unto God. They felt this lull of time where God seemed absent, and now they had this intermediary, and his name was Moses, who could go between them and God. And not only could they hear from God, but on multiple occasions, these were kind of boneheaded individuals. I mentioned before what his greatest feat was actually to even get them to the promised land. But on multiple occasions, they directly disobeyed God. They grumbled and they complained. No sooner that Moses brings the tablets down the mountain or they're worshiping other gods. And on several different occasions, God wanted to eliminate them. He wanted to send down bolts of lightning. He wanted to send snakes to kill them. He wanted to open up the ground and destroy them. He wanted to do this. Yet Moses, because of his passion for his people, but as a connection to God, he went to God on their behalf. And he asked God to still his anger and to be able to give them another chance or to organize things a different way. And you know the crazy thing about that was that God actually listened to him. God changed his mind based upon Moses' mediation. That's an amazing thing. And the people of Israel never forgot that. They never forgot the fact that there was somebody who could actually intercede on their behalf and ultimately save their life and preserve them, at least for a time. Now, Moses was far from perfect. He was certainly not sinless. It's one of the reasons why I love the scriptures as we have them. They certainly could have been written from a different vantage point, especially these ones. I mean, Moses wrote all of this, right? He could have eliminated all of the bad things about his life and only included the good things. But he chose intentionally to be able to include the areas that he needed grace. It's kind of the calling card of our God and people who follow after our God. We don't need to look good. We just need God to be glorious. And by seeing that, all of a sudden we understand grace, which is what Jesus ultimately ushers in. But Moses was not sinless. He killed a guy. He doubted God. He was full of insecurity. He was not necessarily a great husband. He struck the rock out of anger and was ultimately denied from even getting into the promised land that he leads his own people to. Yet this was what was penned about him in Deuteronomy 34. It says, there has never been another prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. The Lord sent him to perform all the miraculous signs and wonders in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all his servants and the entire land. And with a mighty power, Moses performed terrifying acts in the sight of all of Israel. Now, guys, there's so much more to be able to be spoken about Moses. However, we get to see for a little bit of a glimpse of why he was considered to be the greatest person, the greatest prophet in all of Jewish history. He was, in fact, the GOAT of the Jews. Yet the writer of Hebrews, who is communicating this to the Jewish audience, who reveres Moses, flat out tells them that Jesus is better even than that guy. So for some of us, we look at this and we go, yeah, of course Jesus is better than Moses. What you need to understand is that to a Jewish audience, this was an incredible statement. The person who they revered as the greatest prophet of all time, who helped establish their nation in the first place, right, who offered the law and gave us a picture of who God was, you're now telling us that Jesus is better than him, to which the writer would say, exactly. You'll need to understand this. And the way that the writer actually says it, Hebrews 3:3 says this, but Jesus deserves far more glory. Not just more glory, but far more glory than Moses. Just as a person who builds a house deserves more praise than the house itself. I love when the authors give us some allusions or some illustrations to be able to help us understand things. They give us some metaphors. I love this particular metaphor of a builder and a building particularly. I'm going to show you guys a picture here. Maybe you all have seen a picture of this particular house. Have you all seen this? Does anybody know the name of this house? The house actually has a name. Falling Waters is the name of this house. And who built this house? Frank Lloyd Wright. Do you all know of any other famous builders? No, you don't. Okay. But we know Frank Lloyd Wright, right? And we know him by his work because he comes up with these kind of things. Now, this is an amazing house, right? I asked somebody the name of this house in the first service, and they said, my dream house is what they said. This is an amazing thing, right? But as amazing of a product as this is, how much more amazing is the person who actually came up with this idea in the first place? The person who architected this design, the person who actually executed this particular place. An amazing building. But how much more astonishing is Frank Lloyd Wright, the builder of the building, right? The builder is always better than the building. And with that being said, Moses wasn't the architect of God's law. He wasn't the deviser of the plan for God's people. He was simply the contractor laying down what God was sending him. Very important to understand his place in the matter. An amazing man, the greatest prophet of the Old Testament. Yet he was simply a servant, a worker, a contractor in God's plan. Moses helped establish the nation. He helped get them to the promised land. He helped show them the way of God and the law. But the house was ultimately built by God. Let me give you one other illustration or metaphor to maybe help you understand this a little bit better. We see the moon by the light of the sun, correct? That's how we see the moon. Apart from the sun, the moon doesn't shine. There is no light source of its own. We only see a reflection or a refraction of the sun on the moon so that we might be able to see. In a very similar way, when we look at Moses and we look at the law of Moses, it's like looking at the moon. It gives us a picture of, it gives us a reflection of who God is and what he is about and that sort of thing. However, when we see God's Son, the light of the world who is sent to us, somehow veiled his glory so that we could look directly at his Son, it's as if we're seeing the Son directly. That's what we see when we see the Son. He's not a reflection of God. The scriptures tell us that he's the exact representation of God. When you've seen the Son, you've seen the Father. Those are Jesus' own words about himself. Now, Moses was in the presence of God for a moment. He got to see God's backside. Jesus sits at the right hand of the Father and descended from his throne in heaven. He is God incarnate and shielded in glory so that we might be able to see him. Take a look at Hebrews 3:5-6. Moses was certainly faithful in God's house as a servant, but that's what he was. His work was an illustration of the truths God would reveal later, but Christ, as the Son, is in charge of God's entire house. Moses, as great as he was only a servant to God. Jesus is the Son of God. The law of Moses brought about challenge, but the law of Christ brings about change. Moses provided a way for us to conform to. Jesus made a way for us to be transformed by. The scriptures actually tell us that our condition changes because of what God did, because of Jesus' work on the cross. We go from being servants to being heirs to the throne. This is an amazing thing. We go from being slaves to being sons and daughters of God. You see, this is far more powerful, far more beneficial, and far greater than what Moses came to bring in the law of Moses. We'll talk more about the covenant stuff here in a few weeks, but take a look at how Galatians actually describes this event. It says, "But when the fullness of time had come," all right, God had been talking through the prophets. He'd been promising a prophet like Moses to be able to come, to be able to fulfill this. He's speaking of the Messiah coming up here. And when the time would fully come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. He's speaking of the law of Moses here, right? The law by which you know me by, the law by which your whole system of things works, to redeem those who are under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, "Abba, Father." So you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, an heir through God. No Jewish person under the law of Moses, by following what Moses had to say, had their condition changed before God. But because of the work of Jesus Christ on the cross, dying for us, shedding his blood, rising again, and us receiving that, we go from being slaves to being sons. We get to be heirs of a heavenly realm. Guys, Jesus, what he is, who he is, and what he came to do is better than Moses. Now, when you read this chapter, the first few verses are actually meant to convince us of this thing that we've spent the majority of our time talking about today. All right, Jesus is better than Moses, and why that's actually significant. But the rest of the chapter is actually devoted to something different. The rest of the chapter is devoted to making sure that you don't miss out on Jesus. That to make sure that you don't actually reject what Jesus had to come to do, because rejecting Jesus is like rejecting Moses, but even worse. And for us to understand this in context, you had a guy named Paul who was ultimately a follower of Jesus, was called to go to the Gentiles, and he's having conversations with people who don't know about Moses, who don't know about Jesus, a Jew's way, but he's introducing them to Jesus. And he's having these conversations about it, and all of the Jewish converts are going, "Hey, wait, don't forget about Moses, don't forget about the law." Because they actually were like, "Paul, you are rejecting Moses." And he goes, No, I'm not rejecting Moses, because Jesus didn't reject Moses. He fulfilled what Moses had to do, and he's brought something completely new. It is better. And we need to focus in on Jesus, not on Moses, because he's greater. To the point where Deuteronomy 18, God reveals this to Moses, and he says, I will raise up a prophet like you. As awesome as you are, as amazing are the things that you've done, as revered as you are among all the people, I'm going to raise up a prophet like you from among your fellow Israelites. And I will put my words in his mouth, and I will tell the people everything I command. And he will tell the people everything I command. I will personally deal with anyone who will not listen to the messages of that prophet, what he proclaims on my behalf. Now, God is speaking to Moses about a future prophet, this Messiah who will ultimately come, somebody who's greater than him. Moses doesn't know who that is at this time. He just knows that he's coming. And later on in Acts 3, it actually echoes this very promise with the idea of Jesus in reference to him. Moses knew there would be a prophet like him, a prophet that would be greater than him. He didn't know who he was, but he knew that the message that he would come to bring would be more important than the message that he had already brought. Moses understood that the miracles that he had to be able to offer would be greater miracles than the things that he had done. And he knew that the mediation that he was able to offer in intercession to the people was going to be more complete than what he could do. And so he writes down these words that God spoke to him, and he spoke these things very definitively. And he says, guys, keep your eyes out for this prophet. When you hear from him, when you see him, when you hear about what he has done, do not dismiss it. Do not reject this message. You need to make sure to listen to him, because it'll be far worse for you than if it would be to neglect me. And then we get these words in Hebrews 3:15, which I think today is just what echoes in my heart. And it's the thing that if you haven't heard anything else today, I want you to hear. Hebrews 3:15 says this: today, when you hear his voice, don't harden your heart. Today, when you hear his voice, don't harden your heart. Many of you guys, if not all of you guys, have heard the message of Jesus Christ. You've heard about what he's done. You've heard about who he is, the God of all things coming in flesh, living among us, being sinless, going to the cross on our behalf, shedding his blood to offer us a new covenant, raising his life again from death and conquering again, and offering us eternal life for anybody who would receive him. If you hadn't heard it before, you just heard it now. But many of us have heard the message of Jesus. You know who he is and what he stands for, and yet you have not fully surrendered your hearts to him. You've not surrendered your lives to him. You've not turned over your keys to your life and said, you know what, it's better off in your hands. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. And maybe for you, it's been an intellectual battle. Maybe you just don't think that you know enough, and you've been wrestling with this and trying to figure these things out a little bit more. Maybe for some of you, it's a sin struggle. It's something that you've been dealing with, and you go, I can't fully surrender to God because I've got this issue in my life, and it's been overtaking me, it's been overcoming me. I just don't feel right giving my life over to Christ until I deal with this. To which Jesus would say, come to me, let me deal with it for you. Let me give you some help. Let me give you my spirit. Let me help you to deal with that. Maybe for some of you, it's a pride issue. You've been in control of your life, or you think that you're in control of your life, and you just don't want to surrender that over to somebody else who's going to tell you where to go and what to do. For some of you, it's a faith issue. You've been let down by so many people and so many times in your life. You just don't want to put your hands in the life of somebody else who might just let you down again. Might I beckon you and plead with you like the writer of Hebrews does? It's time to give Jesus a chance. And not because of what he has done or who he was, but because of who he is and what he's doing. You see, I believe that you need to know, and I believe that the people around us need to know more than the Jesus of the Bible. They need to know the Jesus of your life. More than what God has done in the past, they need to know what God is actually doing in your life and in your midst. They need to know that he's still relevant. They need to know that Jesus is still delivering people from their addictions. Jesus is still saving people from their sins. Jesus is still rescuing people from their situations. Jesus is still satisfying people's greatest desires. Jesus is still transforming people's lives from slaves to sons and daughters. Jesus is still proving himself worthy of your worship, and your life is in better hands when you've surrendered to him. He won't let you down, but you have to surrender to him. Today, when you hear his voice, when you've heard of what he's done, don't harden your hearts. Step into that. Step into his arms. Let him call you son. Let him call you daughter. Today, I want to encourage you guys, if you haven't surrendered yet to Jesus, I want to encourage you that today's the day. Put your trust in him. We've got some towels up here. They're surrender towels. And here in a moment when we enter into a time of response, if you haven't made that step today and you would like to, I want to encourage you to come grab one of these towels. It simply surrenders that my life is no longer mine. I'm raising the white flag of surrender. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. And we'll have a conversation about what that looks like to get baptized. In the meantime, I want you all to watch some examples of two individuals who've come today to be able to do this very thing and surrender their life to Jesus. So watch this.